Hey everybody, welcome to the Leek. I'm John as always, and the core set 2019 pre-release is only a couple days away, and it launches on MTGO tomorrow, so expect a bonus video tomorrow afternoon, evening sometime. Last set I did a quick primer video and people really seemed to like it, so I'm going to continue doing that. If you like things, I keep doing them. I'll go over some of the archetypes in draft, key cards to look out for, little tips that I think will be helpful, and then go over all the instant speed tricks that you need to be aware of. Up first, I'm going to give you my grand takeaway early at the start of the video because I think it's an important takeaway because I do think this set has traps built into it. If you're new to core sets and you've been happily drafting Dominaria, Ixalan, Amonkhet, Kaladesh, etc., you may think that synergy and archetypes are the name of the game. Pick a mechanic, pick a tribe, pick a theme, and dive into it. M19 even sort of looks like that. There's tribal lords, there's a spirit lord and a zombie lord, there's a life gain deck, there's a spells deck, etc., but I think that that line of thinking is a trap. I think decks in M19 Limited are going to need to be good two-color decks, often splashing for one, maybe two off-color or three-color bombs. I think the life gain deck will actually need to be just a good black-white deck that happens to have some life gain things in it that'll be nice if they come together. The spells deck in blue-red needs to be a good blue-red tempo deck that has some spells matters stuff in it that will be nice if you get it, and so on. So let's dive into the actual archetypes, or what we'll call archetypes, with black-white life gain deck. The one that most people are talking about, the one that I got yelled at a lot in my set review, because of course X card goes in the life gain deck, and Y card goes in the life gain deck, etc. The secret of the life gain deck is that there's very, very, very few ways of paying off all of that life gain. You have a Johnny's Pridemate, Resplendent Angel, Epicure of Blood, Regal Bloodlord, and Nightmare's Thirst, and that's it. The Angel's mythic, so we can ignore that in the average draft. There's a decent chance you may just never, ever see her, even if you do 50 drafts. And except for Epicure of Blood, the rest are uncommon, which means on average there's going to be 1, or actually 0.9 copies per draft. That means if anyone else at the table is attempting this deck, one of the two of you is just going to fail most likely. In addition, the Pridemate and the Thirst are actually just decent enough cards that any black or white deck should be picking them up if they have even the tiniest amount of life gain in their decks. So the problem here is that if you dive into that black-white life gain deck and you only have 1 or 2 payoffs, you're going to have a deck jammed full of mediocre life gain cards doing nothing other than, aha, gaining you a life a turn. Yay, because you didn't find your Pridemate earlier enough, or your Epicure of Blood or something. Think back to Dominaria and imagine building a deck that only can win if you draw your Coldwater Snapper and your Arcane Flight. Sure, that combo was really powerful, but you had to draw those 2 specific cards, and if your deck couldn't win otherwise, you were just going to lose way too often. So like I mentioned, and I think most quote-unquote archetypes in the set will be, you need to have a good black-white deck. It's got removal, it's got some good creatures, you've got good life gain, Child of Night, Skymarch Bloodletter, etc., and you happen to have a Johnny's Pridemate and a Regal Bloodlord. Realistically though, you're just not going to have this board state of 3 or 4 or 5 payoffs and then a whole bunch of life gain doing cool stuff with it. It's going to come together super, super, super rarely. Blue-white is the artifacts deck, but again, I think you will be far better served if you have a blue-white regular run-of-the-mill Flyers deck that happens to have a few artifact synergies going on. White has basically a single playable payoff with Aether Shield Artificer, and blue has next to nothing other than the rare Psy and Skilled Animator. The other payoffs are really too mediocre to really bother with, like Gearsmith Prodigy or Trusty Pack Beast or so on. And then, unfortunately, the artifacts are primarily across the board mediocre. You could maybe justify an Encyclopedia or I guess a Diamond Mare or a Manalith if you're splashing, but there's so many bad artifacts that you do not want to weaken your deck heavily just to do what? Make a 1/2 into a 2/2? Woo! Similarly, draft a good blue-white Flyers deck, and if you have the Artificer or if you have Psy, maybe play a couple of the Thopters or a couple of little decent artifacts. But I think if you dive into an artifact deck, you're going to have some problems. Black-red, I think, will be the most archetype-like deck, similar to what we've seen in past years since the last core set, and that's because a huge portion of the cards exist at common. And basically nothing you need or want is at rare. Active Treason and Thud is a combo that you can almost guarantee, if you want to play it, that you'll be able to get it in a draft because it's a combo at common. Both cards are at common, and... Hey everybody, Future John here. Thud's clearly not common. What the hell am I talking about? Anyways, point still stands. This combo is going to be relatively not too hard to put together. Nobody's really going to want them. The average red deck is not going to touch these two cards. The real power starts to show up when you get multiples of those and you combine them with sacrifice outlets like Blood Divination or Ravenous Harpy. And if you want to see some amazing power, throw in a reassembling skeleton and just sacrifice it back and forth forever. Now, even with all of these existing at uncommon and below, you still need to make sure that you're drafting a decent deck with regular removal and fine creatures. Because if you don't find that Active Treason, if you don't find that sack outlet, you still need to win the game somehow. So, good black-red deck, but I think this is probably going to be one of the more fun, one of the more interesting, one of the more archetype-y synergy-type decks in the set. The rest of the decks, I have really far less to say about them, so let's just jam through them quickly. Blue-red spells exists, but it might be hard to get because there are exactly 2 payoffs. Aven Windmage gets bigger for the turn when you cast an instant or sorcery, and it flies, which means it's going to get in for damage, hopefully, and Gutter Snipe is an all-star of a card. By the way, if you're playing Two-Headed Giant, Gutter Snipe is broken. Beyond that, there's a single other card to support the archetype with Salvager of Secrets, and that's it. That's all that's going on there. So it's going to be super hard for this to be a real deck. So draft a good blue-red tempo deck with bounce and some essence scatters and some blue flyers and some aggressive red creatures. And then if you happen to have the bird and the goblin, cool. Throw in a couple more tricks, but don't go ludicrously deep on this. Red-white is your very standard go wide deck. Get your low-cost creatures, your token creators, pair it with a Trumpet Blast or an Inspired Charge, and win. That's all there is to red-white. It's a very real archetype, but it's not really synergy, it's just cast creatures and attack with them. Green-white is touted to be the enchantments deck, but there's so little going on there. Your singular payoff is an expensive 2/2 that draws you a card when you play one. I don't really care about that, especially because generally the only enchantments you really want to be playing are the white removal ones. The green-white deck will really just be a middle ground, I think, between the big rampy green decks and the low curve white weenie decks. You're going to be in the middle of those two decks, and I don't think you'll ever really attempt to do something with enchantments. Blue-black wants to be the discard deck, but again, there's just not much going on there. Discarding doesn't win you the game. The payoffs are really minimal. You'll want a good blue-black control deck, and it'll happen to make your opponent discard some cards. And if you're super lucky, have some sort of synergy with a Fell Spectre damaging them, or maybe Rise from the Grave stealing their stuff. Which, of course, this is also just known as a normal good deck. It's not really an archetype here. So I wouldn't go too deep on thinking, aha, I'm going to discard them to death, because discarding is not a way to win the game. Red-green is the dragon ramp deck, which is really just a standard ramp deck. It just so happens that dragons are the big top end in this set. So it is a ramp deck. It doesn't really matter that it's a dragon ramp deck. Draft your mana dorks, cast your big things. And then also just do the same in green-blue and black-green, just with other things that aren't dragons. The black-green and the blue-green decks really just seem to be like mid-range ramp into creatures, kill opponent. They're going to be the least synergy decks, I believe. So that's about it for what we'll call archetypes in this set. As I want to remind you, I don't think you really want to dive into a theme or a mechanic in this set. I think you want to draft a good deck that has a sub-theme or something along those lines. Getting too cute will be the end of you. Make sure you just have a good deck, and if you can get some of those cool little combos, awesome. The other point that I mentioned way up at the top was splashing. This is going to be a 2-color format, but like most core sets, I think it's a 2-color format where you generally should be trying to splash for a really powerful bomb. Now, Splashing does not mean splashing for murder. You can't splash for a card that has 2 color pips in it of a color that you're not playing otherwise. That's not going to happen with any sort of consistency. You also do not splash for 2 drops or 3 drops. You splash for really late game cards because by the time you can cast them CMC-wise, you'll potentially have drawn your actual color that you need to cast them. And they should be game-ending cards. If they don't end the game, you're going to be better off just not hurting your mana base. People will want to try out 3-color decks if they open one of those mythic 3-color dragons, and I think that'll probably be wrong as well. I think you'll want to be a 2-color deck, preferably green if it's in the dragon's casting cost, and splash for that 3rd color, probably just for that 1 dragon. And then there is one card that you should always splash for, Bane Fire. Bane Fire is an A+, and you literally, I am in no way speaking in hyperbole here, should never, ever pass it. I don't care what colors you're in. I don't care if it's pack 3 and you've taken 0 red cards, Bane Fire will always be the correct pick. But with all that deck building stuff out of the way, let's do a quick overview of what you need to keep in mind about instant speed tricks. If your opponent has mana up and you're in combat or such, these are the cards that you should know about. In white, we start out with 1 mana for Isolate, which no one should ever be playing, so there's nothing really to say about it. At 2, we have Aegis of the Heavens, which isn't really that exciting. The +1 power is probably about as weak a combat trick as you can possibly get, so I wouldn't be too terrified or playing around my creature potentially dying because a creature's going to get 1 extra power. And that +7 typically is just going to act like a fog. A one-sided fog, but a fog nonetheless. Ultimately, I don't expect to run into Aegis of the Heavens that much. It's an uncommon, so already you shouldn't terribly be playing around it, and it's an uncommon that I don't necessarily think that people will terribly be playing. Also at 2 mana, however, is Mighty Leap, which will probably be a little bit more playable. It's usually a very fine combat trick. It's generally going to be used on the offense as a sorcery almost speed effect, usually in the declare attacker's step, so there's not much you can do about it there. But if you're flying in at them because they have no flyers but they do have 1 white up, be aware they might have a surprise blocker. Invoke the Divine at 3 mana is purely a sideboard card, and there's not too much you can do about it, so there's not much to say. I would never expect to see it in Game 1, but in Game 2, if you've got some clear auras or enchantments that you've been showing off, you need to be aware of that may be a blowout a little bit later on. I'd probably still never play it around it, though, until I see it at least once. Finally, at 4 mana is Inspired Charge. If your opponent has been flooding the board with little creatures, you should probably know what's coming. It's going to be this or Trumpet Blast. If they've got 4 mana and a wide board, you definitely need to be considering some double blocks if you can afford it, or otherwise just blocking everything you can in case you die to unblocked creatures that are suddenly beefier. Especially be aware if your opponent's been holding back and suddenly makes a weird Alpha Strike. They've got Inspired Charge. Over in blue at 2 mana we have Disperse. This will see very wide play, namely from me because I love it. Just be careful about putting those auras and things against a blue player with mana up because you might get blown out. Unfortunately, it is pretty hard to play around a Disperse. It's generally gonna happen if they have it, so do what you can to get them to play it out quickly so that you can play your stuff a little bit later, or at least your more important stuff later. Also at 2 is Anticipate, which isn't anything to do with you. It's just your opponent fiddling with their cards. Also at 2 is Essence Scatter, the most playable counterspell in the set. If your opponent has 2 mana up, be careful about running your bomb straight into it. It's likely to be a little bit better play against most decks to play a less decent creature to try to bait out this spell. Play your second best creature in your hand. Get it Essence Scattered, then play your bomb. And hope it doesn't also get Essence Scattered. And if you don't see the Essence Scatter on your second best card, well, that might mean the way is clear for your bomb. At 3 mana is Cancel, a counterspell that's typically telegraphed pretty hard, and also far less typically played. I would never play around it until I see that my opponent is actually a crazy person playing it. Also at 3 is Uncomfortable Chill. This will blow you out when you think your blocks look great, or at least you're going to trade with a bunch of things, and suddenly your creatures aren't trading at all. It's almost like a reverse Trumpet Blast. It's as if your blue opponent got +2/+0. Obviously it doesn't kill you, but it may be a pretty big blowout for your board. At 4 mana is Bone to Ash, less playable than Essence Scatter, more playable than Cancel. Play around it when you can. It should be a little bit more obvious when your opponent has the 4 mana counterspell, and try to bait it out with your second or third best card. Finally, at 5 is Totally Lost, which is the same as Disperse as far as playing around it goes. There's not much you can do, just try to bait it out of their hand as soon as possible. Over in black, of course, we're going to talk mostly about removal. First at 1 mana is the completely unplayable Infernal Judgment. There's just no targets worth playing a card that's literally uncastable the majority of games. If your opponent gets you with this, give him a hand, because it's the only time it'll ever happen in Limited. A real card at 1 mana is Nightmare's Thirst. This is going to make combat a real headache. Even without any extra life gain, that -1/-1 can really mess things up. With life gain, your opponent's going to wreck you. There's not really much you can do here, other than maybe try to hurt their life gain production when you can, so that you keep this as a combat trick and not really a removal spell. At 2 mana is Abnormal Endurance. This trick will probably be the one that gets you the most, but luckily 2 mana is a lot easier to read than 1 mana when this was called Supernatural Stamina, which I also just realized Abnormal Endurance is literally Supernatural Stamina run through a Thesaurus. Anyways, check for that 2 mana and be aware that that trade may just not happen. Even worse, your opponent might actually get to re-trigger an ETB effect. I'm going to fear 2 black mana forever. I'm going to get blown out by this more than any combat trick ever, I think. 3 mana has Murder, which, like all unconditional removal, you just need to try to get rid of with weaker cards before playing your bomb. And same goes for Strangling Spores at 4 mana. Basically, if your opponent's playing black and has mana, your things are going to die. So try to bait it out, but that's about all you can do really against black. Red has a ton of instants. At 1 mana are Smelt and Crash Through, which are both pretty mediocre and you shouldn't really care about. Smelt is sideboard only, and there honestly isn't that much great that it'll go against, so I would never really expect an opponent to play it against me. And Crash Through is typically used more for the card draw and to trigger the Prowish Bird or Gutter Snipe. For real at 1 mana is Shock. Do not go down to 2 life against red if you can help it. You will just die to Shock. At 2 mana are a pair of strikes. We've got Sure Strike, which is a great combat trick and can lead to a huge blowout. Your 2/2 can suddenly destroy bombs in combat and live. So think twice about attacking or blocking when your opponent has that mana up. The first strike here is a real blowout. Lightning Strike is the second strike here, and it's basically Shock but turned up a notch. Don't go to 3 life either if you can help it, or you might just die to red. At 3 mana is Spit Flame, which is a rare, so you really should not see this very often at all, and it can't hit you, so hey, maybe 4 life is safe-ish. Basically like black removal, try to bait this out and then play your bigger things, or just play things that are bigger than 4, and maybe you're a little bit more safe there. Also at 3 is Trumpet Blast, which is just like Inspired Charge. If your opponent's been going wide and Alpha strikes out of nowhere, make those extra blocks, make those double blocks just to be safe. Finally, at 4 mana is Electrify, which can hit you, so no, 4 is not safe either. Don't go lower than 5, because, come on, no one's going to play Lava Axe, right? Green, as usual, is quite lacking on instants, and they all live at 2 mana. Naturalize, Plummet, and Root Snare you can all basically ignore in Game 1. In Game 2, be aware that a Naturalize might mess up your aura plans or blow up an artifact, but again, there's not a ton of those that are really going to, ultimately change the game by your opponent blowing them up. Plummet may just flat out kill a creature, so we're back into removal territory. Be especially careful with sending in a bomb attached to a Pegasus Courser if you're against green in Game 2 or Game 3, because that Plummet might be there. And Root Snare should literally never be played by anybody ever, so don't even think about it. Just attack in anyways. The final 2 mana instant in green is Titanic Growth, which, like most traditional combat spells, is just something to be aware of. But at +4/+4, there's often not much you can do other than maybe hold up a bounce spell or a removal spell of your own to answer it and try to get the 2 for 1. Additionally, you can try to bait it out a little bit late into combat. You can say no blocks, and then they need to cast that Titanic Growth, or else forever hold their peace. So you can get them to cast that Titanic Growth and in response, kill the creature and get that 2 for 1. And then of course there are no gold or artifact or land instance effects to be aware of here. Ultimately, it is really going to come down to a very distilled core set. Each color has basically one combat trick that's going to mess up the power and toughnesses. There's removal in most of the colors. There's the typical bounces, the typical counter spells. There's not much going on here that's tricky to figure out. You just got to remember what can happen at those mana costs. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this primer. I'm super excited to get back to a core set. Core sets are boring, and that's fine. That is fine for a few months to have a really straightforward set. M13, for example, is one of my favorite draft formats ever, and I'm hoping M19 is pretty good as well. Let me know what you think of the format, what you're excited to play. If you agree with my assessments, if you disagree, chat with me, chat with each other down in the comments below. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can find me on Twitter at the Mana Leek. That's L-E-E-K, like the vegetable, not the card. You can find me at facebook.com/ShamanALeek, twitch.tv/ShamanALeek, and patreon.com/ShamanALeek. If you like the content, click that thumbs up button. Click subscribe if you want to see more, and if you do have questions, comments, or suggestions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see y'all at the pre-release.